Welcome to the Book Conversation Series, which is part of the United States and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. My name is Osamah Khalil. I'm a professor in the History Department at Syracuse and host of the workshop. Our guest today is Dr. Megan Black. Dr. Black is Associate Professor of History at MIT, where she specializes in environmental history, U.S. and the world, and political economy. Her recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is The Global Interior: Mineral Frontiers and American Power, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. It's an amazing book and has received a number of awards and top prizes in history, including the George Perkins Marsh Prize, the Stuart Bernath Prize, the Turrentine-Jackson Prize, and the British Association of American Studies Prize. And it's all very well deserved. Dr. Black's articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, Modern American History, and Diplomatic History. She previously taught at the London School of Economics and has completed postdoctoral research at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard and the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth. She received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University in 2015. Dr. Black, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly a pleasure to be a part of this series.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. And I want to just hold up the cover of your book, which is, I love this cover. And it really, it's so great. And I really can't say enough good things about the book. And so hopefully, as we talk about it, some of that is going to come across. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I like to do in this conversation series, especially for first-time authors, is talk about the process, especially, you know, if you were talking to graduate students, and something that graduate students can get out of the conversation series is, how did this project originate for you, and how did you develop it as a graduate student into a dissertation?
Great question, and one that I think will show how much things can change over time in the course of a PhD program and in the process of transforming a dissertation into a book. I went to graduate school at George Washington in DC with an intent to study an intersection of culture and politics. I went to work with Melanie McAllister, and I was very excited to think about how minerals had been rendered and imagined and debated in something like popular culture at an intersection with state power. So the way of kind of setting that stage, I think it helps to understand how I did continue to think about discourses or ideologies that were prevalent in the discussion of minerals over time. So even something like strategic minerals, which seems very inert and neutral, has a kind of history behind why people used that term in that particular moment in the 1930s. But before I knew that I was going there, I went to the National Archives to look at cultural products that the US government had a hand in sponsoring. So if some of my time was spent watching Treasure of the Sierra Madre, others of it was watching horribly boring films with titles like Evolution of the Oil Industry and A Story of Copper that had been paid for by companies like Sinclair Oil or Phelps Dodge Corporation, but that in fact were made by the, wait for it, US Department of the Interior. And this is where my reluctant journey initially with the Interior Department began, because these films were fascinating to me for the very global narratives that they constructed and a story of American mineral supremacy therein. But beyond that, I got into the textual records at NARA that showed that these films also had a very global dissemination and reach. They were circulating in Afghanistan and Colombia and Thailand. And my question quickly became, why? Why on earth were these films going so far? The answer, it turned out, was that they were traveling because Interior Department mineral experts were traveling to places like Afghanistan and beyond. So my research questions shifted, which I think is something I've seen other graduate students now go through since I've been mentoring them. And I think it's a very important, if kind of scary process to go through, to realize that what you think you're doing, you might not be doing in the long run. So eventually I came to also try to understand why the Interior Department was so exterior, for lack of a better term. And that took me in new directions that ultimately proved really productive.
And I think you raise a really important point in terms of, you know, that discovery process that a lot of graduate students, and I think it's interesting, you know, when I think of some of my favorite books, they're often the product of kind of, the accidental discovery, or I was going in this direction, then I found this and it sent me in a completely different direction. And that's how I got here. And I think it's amazing that that's part of the story here.
Yes.
How did you know? I mean, this is always interesting to me. How did you know when you had a viable project? When did it hit you that it's like, okay, I have something here, that this is something I want to run with?
I do think in graduate school, a seminar paper spun from this archive was something that gave me a sense that there was a there. Um, but it took a long time to bear out in an actual like book level way. And so the chapter that is still a centerpiece of the book is about the Point Four program
Right.
that many attribute to Harry Truman. He certainly announced it as a bold new vision for American foreign policy early in the Cold War, and a project that is often associated with US technical assistance in a variety of projects related to dam building or agricultural modernization, but that my work showed distinctly was also very much wrapped up with this thing we associate with a different form of US power, a more exploitative form, mineral extraction. So, so that chapter was something that materialized for me in archives that helped to situate the films that I was thinking about as well, and seeing the kind of benevolent sheen to what these technicians were doing overseas, even as the kind of ends of their work were very similar to things we associate with coups and other kinds of U.S. intervention. So so for me, kind of seeing that the Mossadegh coup in '53 was more richly understood with this kind of step to consider the way the international development apparatus was supportive of and working alongside the more clandestine kind of international and CIA-backed efforts. That to me, I knew was significant. That stuck out to me as a real thing. But it took time to see how that would work at a much kind of bigger view than 1949 to say 1956, which was the original thrust of it.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's such a narrow cut, and then to see what it turned into is really remarkable. It's really remarkable, I think. You mentioned already a couple of times about archives, and this isn't exclusively, for historians, but what were some of those that you used? You mentioned NARA,
Mhm.
and were some of these for the first time? And it's always interesting when you go into an archive and you're the first person there. And it's also interesting when, other people have gone through, but they're looking at other stuff, and you can kind of, follow their
Totally.
trail a little bit. So I'm curious
Mhm.
about the archives, and what did you find, and how, how far did you spread your wings in terms of looking at archives?
Well, to my knowledge, I think I sorted a bit into the second category you mentioned, where people might have been looking at them, but for different reasons. So when I got into Interior Department files, my kind of antennae were always looking for the kind of international, which was not very often
Yeah.
the center of anyone's concern. And so record groups like the Bureau of Mines, the Geological Survey have been analyzed in many ways, often for things related to maybe labor or what's going on in the domestic minerals industry. And the story that I was interested in telling just led me to emphasize other corners of that series. So the technical assistance files, which it seemed nobody had ever really looked at. And then at that intersection, the Bureau of Mines and Geological Survey had their records related to technical assistance, but then so too does Record Group 469, which is Foreign Assistance Agency's files, have an enormous amount related to the mineral development side of that story. So then you see interior personnel at that intersection and parts of that story revealed. But it was piecemeal. So in Bureau of Mines, there was a file on Afghanistan. In foreign assistance agencies, when I was looking at them in DC, they didn't have the files related to that. So I was constantly triangulating sources and using that that combination of sources to get a sense of certain patterns of protocol, procedure, what was unfolding on the ground. And I was able to supplement that with other archives outside of NERA as well, especially those relating to secretaries of the Interior. First, someone like Harold Ickes, who would be an important figure in the FDR administration. And his files were at the Library of Congress, as were Julius Krug's. But then at the Truman Library, you can see what Oscar Chapman in that kind of early Cold War context is thinking. And all of this kind of bouncing around ultimately led me to one of my favorite archives of it all, which was the Stuart Udall papers at the University of Arizona. These have been explored by many historians, Western historians, environmental historians, but to my knowledge, no scholars of US foreign relations, even though we do have this kind of anecdote about, some people might know that the Cuban Missile Crisis was randomly struck by a conversation that Udall had with Khrushchev that conveyed the threat of the kind of Cuban capacities backed by Soviet arms. So this is something that I think I saw early in my studies, but until I got into the archive and saw these pictures of Udall from all around the world during his lengthy tenure as Secretary of the Interior, it really brought home for me that this was a book, I think, so that's something that I actually completed in that transition to my postdoc fellowship. So I was rounding out the tour of presidential libraries and then secretaries' papers. And to a degree, also was lucky to be able to get with sources that could get me on the ground a bit more and away from DC, specifically, but always through the lens of US technical experts. I wish that there had been more time and room to switch perspectives more sincerely. But one, for example, was a geological survey man named Eugene Callahan, who left his papers to the University of Utah and left the only archive that I know of a Bolivian tin survey that had been classified and never published. So even though US Geological Survey reports are widely available to this day and can be left as this kind of footprint, this global footprint of the organization, the Bolivian World War II files just weren't there until you get into this one man's papers and you can see the pictures he took and you can see the kind of field notes from his journey. And for me, that was a really satisfying find in the archive. So
That's great.
Yeah, there were some other inputs as well, but those really were the central ones. They were framed always by US power, but US power in unexpected places or told from an unexpected vantage point.
Wow, that's fantastic. Those are great stories, and it's always amazing. You can't encourage it enough when you think about it as a graduate student. I'm just going to get out to the archive and see kind of what I find, and then it's amazing when you actually find these great and very deep sources. So you kind of hinted at it a couple of times, and as you're making this transition from dissertation to book, and it sounds like you expanded kind of the scope of it beyond what you had. Of course, was it originally intended, but how did you start to reconceptualize the project as a book, and what factors did you take into account as you were thinking about it?
I first have to confess I was very lucky to have time, 2
Right.
years on a postdoc, which was in my mind really empowering to make a tough decision, which was effectively to scrap half of my dissertation. Not something anyone wants to do per se after residing with those sources for so long, but I realized that I had to admit the riddle that I was most perplexed by and most invested in trying to answer was about the Interior Department and when and why it was in these exterior spaces, as well as why it had been so easily obscured from view. And that required thematic, temporal, and spatial changes. So if my dissertation was a part cultural history, part institutional history in the post-war era, then the book became much more focused on the Interior Department's mineral pursuits. And I was looking into new thresholds that it was entering into, which is how you can see I ended up with the Continental Shelf at some point as like a different terrain, a different threshold being crossed for management. But I was also being challenged by mentors and others to think earlier than the post-war. So in the Second World War, they were in Latin America. And before the Second World War, they had taken over the division of territories and island possessions, calling attention to imperial management in overseas contexts, as well as Alaska and this complex imperial circuitry that, that the New Deal era marked a kind of decisive shift from War Department to Interior Department. And that I learned was hardly the first time that kind of transfer of power had happened, because then I was finally forced to look to the very origins of the department in 1849. And this partly had been a seed planted in my head from an early archival find in the 50s, where an interior official explains their international portfolio by hearkening back to this history. You know, first it was the 1850s, when in the continental West, they were overseeing those frontiers. Now it's the 1950s. Well, eventually, with that extra time to rethink the book, I was able to take the long frame and try to make sense of its 19th century origins in the wake of the Mexican-American War, and a kind of original identity of, yes, managing domestic affairs, but domestic in the sense of newly domestic, territory that had just been brought in through Continental War between 1846 and 1848. But that territory also entailed resources, and it had people, indigenous people with competing sovereignties. So there was still a federal process that was unfolding and ongoing. The Interior Department was a critical part of the story of making Manifest Destiny align with those kinds of expectations and practice, though it never fully succeeded. And that's part of the story too, of its kind of ongoing relations with Indigenous North Americans.
And I think it's a great aspect of the story is that it's in a sense, you talk a lot about a contingency in the book, and I think what's great is that you can look at these plans and the aspects of Manifest Destiny and how much they are still challenged on the ground. And I think it's such an important aspect of the book, which we should dig into if you don't mind. So I think it, and you've done a great transition. I thank you for that, because as you've mentioned, the focus is the Interior Department, right? And which is not often the focus of books on America's relationship with the world. And I think that's what's so fascinating about your book. I think what's also fascinating is that you make a very important argument about the U.S.'s global reach, and that it merged activities, in this case with the Interior Department, that have been often attributed to soft and hard power. And so how was that evidenced in the activities of the Interior Department?
This is so critically important. And I think is a tension within the department from its origins through to the present. When we think about the department's origins in 1849, it is in many ways meant to deal with a problem of governance across a continent that had been wrapped up in war, and that through the 19th century would continue to see the presence of US military. So much of US indigenous relations through 1870s, 1880s is still marked by pronounced violence. And one observation that had been made early in the department's history was that it needed to do the civilizing part of this mission, not just the kind of warmongering part of this mission. And that, I think, in many ways helped to alleviate the kind of humanitarian impulses that were emerging in civil society about how this nation would somehow cohere as part of this nation building process that required the dispossession of indigenous land, of land that had belonged to Mexico, of a kind of ongoing and contested process. So in some ways, I jokingly call it good cop to bad cop, or, the kind of civilizing arm to that which is very clearly about the brunt force of military power. And this is a role that the department played in 20th century contexts as well. In the moment in 1898, when we think of the United States as, decisively embracing a kind of overseas empire in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, the Interior Department was simultaneously sending interior personnel and mineral experts as part of that personnel to do the work of kind of civilian um, surveying, civilian education. I focus less on that, but other emerging scholarship is doing incredible work to show us precisely how the kind of Indian education impulse within the continent was very much a critical part of US bureaucracy in the Philippines. This is something Genevieve Clotario is writing about. And um, and there's other great work by Karen Miller thinking about settler colonial practices that are happening in the Philippines. So I, though, as you see in the book, pivot a little bit ahead in the future to think about the 1930s as the decisive moment when Interior actually takes over from the War Department in a tangible way, the administration of territorial affairs. So if before they had kind of a merged role, by 1934, it would be the case that the Interior Department, with its more administrative, technical, neutral, and civilian capacities, would be charged with managing America's empire. And this is something that FDR consciously does with a recognition of the anti-imperialist sentiment that is growing around the world. And many involved in this process, whether Harold Ickes or more centrally Ernest Gruening, who would become the actual head of the Division of Territories and Island Possessions, would convey this ambivalence about America's imperialism. Part of how they squared that circle with this desire to be the kind of moralizing global leader that they aspired to was to say that America's empire was exceptional. Part of what made it so exceptional was that it was really, a kind of technical uplift that that happened through a series of projects that in many ways became a kind of proving ground, not the only one for American modernization and development in the post-war years, but certainly a template for the kind of technical, neutral form of engagement.
And I think it's such an important point, especially this role of expertise, in this case, technical expertise. And one of the things I love about your book and the chapter you referenced earlier on point 4 is, often point 4 is kind of seen as this, failed experiment in development, right? The abandoned experiment. And I think what's so important about your book is that you show that it's much more than that, right? It's so foundational to what comes. And I think it's a mistake to look at it as this abandoned, a kind of an abandoned Cold War project, right? That it has much deeper roots, and I think that you do an amazing job with that. So I think it's really important.
Thank you.
And as is this idea of the role of expertise, particularly technical expertise, and we talk a lot about American exceptionalism and this idea of the United States kind of thinking of itself differently. The empire of liberty, and that's often the phrase that's related to when we think about kind of American exceptionalism,
Right.
particularly why to think of itself as an empire. But I think you've just hit on a really important point, which was, oh no, here's what we're going to emphasize, right? In this kind of this moment when empire has a bad name, we're a different empire because we're going to bring you knowledge that's and this technical knowledge is completely value free in a way, right? And so it's a great point. I think it's so influential, not just in terms of what it draws out of your book, but I think it taps into that exact moment. It's really important. And within that, you've mentioned the two of them already, but you profile two very influential and secretaries of the Interior. And I think most people, when they think of the Interior, often think of these two, and Harold Ickes and Stuart Udall. How did they view the role of the Interior? Was it similar? Was it different? I mean, and did Udall build on Ickes, or did he try and draw his own path?
Right. So Ickes is so important for so many reasons. One, a very lengthy time as an official in the cabinet level position. So the duration of FDR's tenure, and that allowed him, I think, to pull more levers than we can often associate with certain cabinet level officials whose hands might be tied or whose time might be limited. From the get-go, it was clear that Ickes saw in the Interior Department a key arm to discharge the promises of the New Deal. So he really approved of the kind of schematic, the vision for how to get out of the Great Depression by marshaling resources and putting people to work, right? And in many ways, the Interior Department's conservation platform became a way to kind of bring different parts of that together. So we can think of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is like not just interior, it's like a related kind of arm, but something that that Interior is and Ickes were excited to get involved with, to showcase relevance. Ickes was very concerned with putting the Teapot Dome scandal that had recently been in Interior's history behind him. And minerals became important to that, in part because the department lost control over Forest Service capabilities, which has a much longer and more complicated history than we need to get into. But these resources were, of course, becoming important to industrialization and eventually to the war effort. So Ickes brought the Bureau of Mines back together with the US Geological Survey. He declared himself petroleum czar, overseeing first the kind of pre-war planning around oil and then eventually turning that towards an even more important role in wartime planning. So Ickes wore that kind of conservationist badge, but it's important that that was also never separate from population management. So even as he would push to change the name of the department to the Department of Conservation, Ickes was associated with a period of famous reform in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. John Collier, another important colleague who was overseeing a greater amount of self-determination among the kind of relations in the 1930s. And there was also the department's role in the division of territories and island possessions that I've already mentioned. So with this population management, though, Ickes is also a figure who's often described as being very racially liberal for his moment and progressive in his moment. And it's not something that that I challenge so much as reframe, and as I think I try to do with John Collier, as I think I try to do with Ernest Greening, is people who, yes, will espouse a worldview in which no person should be discriminated against based on their color or creed, religion, and so on. But they maintain this kind of belief in fundamental difference that is maybe less biological and more cultural in orientation. So they fit into that kind of movement with anthropologists and others at the time who have better intentions, which we see in Ickes overseeing a hiring initiative for Black Americans in the New Deal, and other kind of moments in signaling a civil rights agenda that would, of course, not materialize, even as then the New Deal could so clearly perpetuate exclusionary policies, right? And so even the kind of the New Deal reforms associated with the Bureau of Indian Affairs had other kinds of problems and omissions and one-size-fits-all policies that failed. So I mentioned that as just a way of trying to keep tabs on, even though I think my book doesn't do this enough, the fact that Interior's kind of population side continues to have very important effects across the 20th century and 21st century. Udall is someone who steps into the role with a passion for conservation as well, that is also building on more recent innovations in environmental thought or different strands, including the aesthetic strand that prioritizes national parks and wilderness zones as a necessary escape from industrialization. That certainly has an earlier form as well, but Udall really embodied that and made it a point to like get out and be seen, taking advantage of hiking trips and mountain climbing and things across America's national parks. He also was more ecological in his thinking, which is possible in a kind of post Rachel Carson and post, ecological knowledge in a like 1940s and after context. So he will speak more about the web of life and interconnection than Ickes ever would, who is much more of a utilitarian conservationist. So there's much more to say, I'm sure, but
No,
I
that's
think,
that's great. I think it's and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the differences between them, but also how much of it was about time period. Now, and Ickes takes on it's it's so difficult to kind of think about it in present day, but he takes on an enormous, as you just laid out, an enormous number of areas of control, and responsibility, and it's remarkable. And I think we often, as you just explained, we often tend to forget in the context of total war, how much leeway was given to cabinet members, and especially when Ickes has, his idea of the New Deal is closely tied to FDR, and you see some of that being. I mean, were you taken aback by how powerful of a secretary he was, or as you were researching this?
Yes, I think of a quote that I think David Lilienthal supposedly said to Ernest Greene. So it has that kind of layer of, and that telephone-like quality, but it was to the effect of Harold Ickes is convinced that he can run every arm of the government better than anyone who's running it. So you see him get into these kinds of squabbles, whether it's the TVA or whether it would be like with the War Department or State Department was one that when sort of discharging duties related to the Philippines became contentious. But I do think there were limitations to his power, and that there were occasionally moments where his vision was so ambitious that it didn't materialize in the ways that he intended. And we see this in his early ambitions related to petroleum in the Middle East. He wanted to, instigate these like a pipeline and to like exert, U.S. national control in such an early period. I mean, many policymakers after that would be trying to work out the means of this, but Ickes was pretty early in saying, no, that should be ours. And it's something that Udall and others would elaborate on, but there were thankfully some checks on that power, though you're totally right. It is a critical moment in mineral policy when executive authority and cabinet level authority in dictating priorities and policies is very high. And we see a kind of contemporary longing for that type of capacity with all the talk of the Defense Production Act in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. But yes, in a moment of emergency, it was astonishing how much leeway was given to people claiming expertise and leading technocracy in that moment.
And it's fascinating how he's so confident as well. It's not, I mean, as that quote the apocryphal quote that you just mentioned brings up, that he is, and he's a new, we think about it when we think about the New Deal Democrats. I mean, that's one of the things, is the confidence they had in reshaping not just the United States, but reshaping the world. And this is, and I think you can see that in him. It's fascinating. If we can, I thought it might be good if we took a step back and we kind of trace out, as you do in the book, Interior's role across this, really it's across a century. And you talk about it as a tool of settler colonialism in the U.S.'s westward expansion. And it also becomes that same tool when the United States becomes a global hegemon. And so, I love this line that you write, that the Interior Department was born of and for American expansionism. So, and that starts, as you referenced, really with Indian affairs. So what actions did it take, and where, and how does that, And how do you see that then, trickling across the American century, quote unquote?
Yes. Well, I've mentioned in our conversation a kind of set of procedures that, in my mind, of course, change over time, but have some of that original disposition or original skill set. And skill set and know-how are words that are constantly cropping up in the archive as people who are Interior Department officials explain what they're doing. Like, why are you here? What are you doing in Chile or Saudi Arabia? Well, there's a know-how and a knowledge that is vital in this context. Early in the 19th century, this know-how, if we call it that, involved things like surveying land and resources. It involves parceling land and codifying it. So here we might think of um, the General Land Office and the US Geological Survey, which were a part of the capacities of the government at that time. But by the time we get to the 20th century, I'm not trying to claim that the federal bureaucracy looks exactly the same. In fact, much of this story is important consolidation of certain forms of knowledge. There's a professionalization of science that is necessary to understanding this history that people like Clarence King, who would lead the Geological Survey, would be a part of. And at the same time, though, it's still about dealing with the problem of land and dealing with the problem of getting the resources out of the land. And so by the turn of the 20th century, the department had done much of the work of disposing of land and resources, though certainly not all. And it's important to note that public land remains today, public being what we now call land that had once been foreign land that has been, taken into the national fold, but enumerated and codified and registered in ways that certainly fit a Foucauldian model as well of administration and governance and legibility. But it also increasingly becomes specialized knowledge across a suite of natural resources. The Interior Department, as I hinted at, had a variegated set of resources it oversaw, biological and mineral, but came to be seen by people like Gifford Pinchot, for example, a famous conservationist and forester, as an institution that simply could not be trusted to oversee biological resources because it so often prioritized mining interests and let's say timber interests over the kind of more elongated usage and planning around those natural resources. So the department responds to this criticism, including calls to close its doors at the end of the 20th century, which we associate with the moment that the American frontier closed, however false and hopeful and wrong that characterization was. And it began sort of becoming the institutional home of conservation, still with minerals as a central critical part of its functioning, but also Bureau of Reclamation, National Park Service become enfolded. And what I've found in looking at these archives is just how deeply entangled these different functionings of the Interior Department are. Thankfully, I didn't have to write that all in my book because there's so much work in environmental history, Native American history that shows that kind of overlap and interconnection. It doesn't mean that these bureaus always wanted the same thing, but it does mean that the kind of meso-level Interior Department could frequently orient these in a way that that fulfilled certain national and private interests. And yes, so resources became an arena of expertise that justified the continuation of the department and that could be portable to new frontiers, and including those that were a part of expanded US territory, like the context of formal imperialism, but it was also portable in contexts where imperialism, as you nicely framed it, was out of fashion. It's become this kind of justly critical object of derision, right? And so the kind of resource expertise, which has new forms, but also old forms like surveying. The process of surveying has changed by the 1950s from the 1850s, but there are some parts of that that are tried and true. And it still involves relying on local knowledge, enlisting local camp hands of different kinds of backgrounds to participate in the kind of scientific study of land and resources. So that was a kind of pattern that I tried to follow throughout the book, and to translate to other weird places, whether it's the continental shelf, where parceling is very much still at play by the same bureau that oversaw it, or it's the Bureau of Land Management, which had merged the GLO and the Grazing Service at an earlier moment, and the Geological Survey, except the new bonanza is one that is unfolding underwater in submerged lands, and not in California, but on the coast, and it's odd to see that reflected, because it is Alaska, it is, the Gulf of Mexico, and new frontiers were being pursued with that language intact, because frontiers is and has often been a kind of legible framing for people in the Interior Department.
Well, to build on your point, I think it's of course such a central factor here, which is the role of minerals, right? And so you talk about how prior to World War I, the minerals were, quote, the central hinge of the Interior Department. And then what I really like about the book is that you draw out kind of there are those officials within the Interior Department who are influenced by conservationists and this idea of resource scarcity. And then there are others who are totally aligned with corporate interests. And you talk about the tensions there. So how did those tensions develop before World War II? And what were some of the important corporations? I mean, some of them are still around today. Some of them we've forgotten about, but at the time they were the equivalents of our Microsofts, and Googles. And so curious about some of that.
Great. Well, there were tensions, as you said, around whether to try to conserve resources or whether to privatize and dispose of resources. And disposal had long been the framework in the 19th century. So it makes sense that would continue to have a home. In a much later context, James Watt shares in a lot of those assumptions. But in that interwar period, there was also a set of debates about international versus domestic sources. And you can imagine that while the oil companies had taken dramatic leaps already by the 1920s to find foreign sources of oil, most mineral producers were slower to kind of take up these international ventures. They were risky. And much of the relationship between interior and private industry, when it concerns a kind of promoting those works, is about helping to mitigate the risk of investing in and extracting resources from a financial perspective, not an environmental or ecological perspective. So in that set of debates, we know the kind of marker of Hoover's protectionism, for example, Hoover being a mineral expert, actually, who had worked in Australia, who had himself been a part of the international mining circuit, but who would propose strengthening America's domestic mining sector by disincentivizing international sources. Even so, the lesson of World War I as shorthand is that bottlenecks to supplies of resources created real threats to the well-being of the war effort. And people were attuned to the fact that also, in a kind of Wilsonian liberal internationalism, that exchanging resources across borders could promote peace, right? So this is an idea that it exceeds beyond geologists, but also built from a kind of conservationist observation that resources are where they are, and we all might need something that the other person has, and that trading those resources can build up a kind of security based in economic trade. So yeah, these coexisted, right? And eventually how this tension got resolved was to say that the Interior Department was very often trying to still appease Western domestic mining interests, more independent producers, But they also thought that conservation relied on exploitation elsewhere. So they were excited to access resources beyond borders, especially when something like some minerals were simply not in high supply in the United States. Chromium is one example we could point to. There are so many others. And so when it came to like that Second World War planning, and the prelude to that, so 1930s is when the Strategic and Critical Minerals Act helps to define priorities that would be actionable for the following decades. The department could still incentivize companies working overseas and identifying sources beyond borders, but use things like stockpiling initiatives to absorb some of the domestic supplies that might not have been as competitive. And there's like a much more complicated history to that. It's not that it wasn't without friction, it certainly was, but I see this pattern in which even with this problem of tensions between domestic and international sources, Interior could help to continue to appease both imperatives.
I think it's fascinating, this discussion about, the content perpetual peace, but in this case through minerals, right? So this is a way through using the environment and using minerals. It's not even the environment, using conservation is a way for us to achieve perpetual peace. It's turning that logic on its head, it's really fascinating.
Yes, because minerals were so quickly then associated with the worst forms of
Right.
imperialism. And this gets to a point that, again, you raised about, it's now very, very bad. It's got a very bad PR problem, US imperial agents, and they are trying to exceptionalize their action. But what they're bouncing off against are things like, King Leopold in Belgian Congo and Cecil Rhodes and these people who have justly become targets of international disdain. So they're trying to find ways around the problem of minerals and their darker associations. And there are an imaginative range of ways that they think of minerals and showcase minerals as benevolent. So.
And so, I mean, which leads us, I think, to an interesting, if we could, how did that pursuit? So, you talk about going after domestic resources. How did the pursuit of mineral rights overseas, how was that, and how is that different for the Interior Department? How did they change, or did they change their interactions, especially working in kind of the informal territories and sovereign countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere?
Right.
Was there a different way that they approached it, or was it almost the same but just in a different locale?
So this also gives me a chance to reply to your question about which companies are they working with. I mean, on some level, you could say there is a continuation of relationships with certain companies. So Phelps Dodge Corporation in Arizona Territory is one key institution that benefited from Interior's role in continental expansion, that conveyed a certain amount of ambivalence about whether or not to go international, but ultimately did, and could rely on the sorts of spade work that interior technicians would do overseas. I see these processes as resembling each other, certainly, because again, like the survey process, which is a kind of first pass at exploration, and is something that was really valuable to companies in both contexts, whether it's continental expansion, whether it's overseas. Companies begrudgingly admit that the Geological Survey, this government arm, is a really valuable entity for them. And that's accompanied by other things like the Bureau of Mines, the Bureau of Land Management. So some companies like Bethlehem Steel had been involved in Cuba and operating under like more local sounding subsidiaries. The Interior Department had obviously had longstanding ties to this powerhouse steel producer, but could be a part of the sort of information gathering and legitimation process in contexts overseas. They continued to do exploratory work for Bethlehem that didn't always pan out, but I often see the cases that didn't pan out as still being significant because it saves valuable time, money, and energy from company geologists in doing the same kind of work in faraway places. The oil industry and fossil fuels are and have long been very proximate to the Interior Department. The major copper producers, Kennecott, Anaconda, and Phelps Dodge, in a variety of zones in the American West, which had only through the work of the Interior Department and others come to be a part of the national framework, to Alaska, which similarly became a part of the national framework, and then to horizons and across the Western Hemisphere and beyond. So those are kinds of collusions that, while not always perfectly amicable, you can see in Cuba that Bethlehem Steel is kind of annoyed with the US government and what it's trying to get it to do in the Second World War. There are nonetheless very advantageous things for private industry in and through this relationship. And sometimes that's just, getting the concessions, getting the permission to do the mining, getting a new legal framework. I show instances in international development when, following orders, interior technicians work to change the legal regime to allow for foreign companies to legally explore and develop mining operations overseas. So they were pals, right? And we get this narrative of kind of anti-government sentiment among mining firms, and certainly they hate government regulatory function. But in these zones where the Department of the Interior is consciously a promoter of private industry, they're total buddies, right? Or I think at one point I say in the book, with enemies like the Interior Department who needed friends.
And I think what's great is because this connects to one of the other book conversations I'm doing this semester is what you just described, which was the losses, those that didn't work out, ended up falling on the federal government. But and so the corporations were able to benefit from all the successes, and the losses were essentially socialized, right?
Yes,
and it's so
absolutely.
And it's so familiar to this language that we hear today, whether it's about pharmaceutical research or the banking industry, that there's the losses are often socialized and the taxpayers bear the brunt of it, and it's the corporations that get the benefit from
definitely
from the wins. So one of my favorite chapters is the chapter on the Continental Shelf, and I think you do, as you've talked about, so much of the focus of the book is on land, and then you do this great thing where you go, okay, now we're going to go to sea, and then we'll talk about another leap you make in a bit. That I think sets the book apart from any other kind of from other monographs or your most typical first monograph. So you discuss this claim, the U.S.'s claim over the Continental Shelf, and you describe it as a radical redrawing of territorial sovereignty. But then you note that it, quote, fell almost entirely from view, and I think that's fantastic. And so much of what you're describing in the book is when you talk about kind of the Interior Department that was also exterior, but how much of it is in plain sight, but then not seen. And I think that's what's so great about the Continental Shelf discussion. So what drove that expansion? And again, here we come back to this, which is this balance between a federal government, as you describe it under Ickes, that's expanding in power, and then trying to balance with corporate interest in the post-war, during and after the post-war. So kind of two questions there, but take them as you wish.
Right. So like much of the expansion of the executive branch authority, it does hinge on the Second World War, and in the sense that the federal government identifies a potential source of oil, which is increasingly important to the war machinery. They can't even imagine how important it will be to post-war economic expansion and peacetime prosperity. But Ickes notes that the continental shelf, or even just the Gulf of Mexico, was imagined to have, 1 billion gallons of oil just waiting to be utilized. Private industry, of course, had a vital part to play in this. They had been experimenting with methods, the technological capabilities to drill in the seabed is within the 3-mile territorial limit that had traditionally adhered to national territory. And so their part is not incidental, like it's not small, it's very important. But in the absence of a legal and legislative framework, there is not licit drilling beyond this 3-mile limit. And there's not an incentive to develop the capacities to drill in these deeper, more dangerous contexts. So, so Ickes is quick to push Roosevelt to pursue this policy of enlarging the legal bounds around the continental shelf. And there are legitimate concerns in wartime about how this will play as a public relations event when the world is fighting Nazi and Japanese expansionism. Would this look like an enclosure, a territorial land grab from a nation that is seeking to have good relations with allies, that is trying to present a vision of kind of moral leadership as part of its wartime effort? And that reservation about what the kind of fallout from an international scrutiny perspective could be was an inhibition to prevent that from unfolding during FDR's tenure. And it really wasn't until Truman stepped into power that this seemingly rational suggestion was then acted upon in the form of an executive order. And ultimately, as a kind of side note, the State Department and Cordell Hull in particular were kind of surprised to learn that other nations were excited about this. Of course, they spoke to other coastal nations like, Argentina, do you think this is a good idea? And there was a lot of support from people from nations around the world, even though, of course, there were questions about how this should be drawn up. And this would continue through many UN debates culminating in the 1980s. But before we get to that point, the executive order matched with then the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act helped to define and enlarge the underwater territory of the United States. And this ultimately ended up mirroring in a lot of ways what Ickes imagined. He guessed that it would be about the size of the Louisiana Purchase, and the continental shelf lands did add around 850,000 square miles to US territory, which is roughly a little larger than the Louisiana Purchase. So that was also a point of contention. The United States ultimately opted not to accept the international standards for defining what its shelf lands looked like. And when you look at comparing the maps of the international way of doing things versus the national way of doing things, it reflects enclosure, because you see the United States version, it is the parceling logic, it is square markers that go into the sea, whereas the sort of exclusive economic zones defined by international law are organic curves that follow the actual land mass. And they roughly resemble each other, but in that kind of difference, I see important and telling histories of U.S. power and this desire to privatize or capitalize on the resource potential of this, what had for a long time been understood as a global good, a common heritage that did not belong to one nation or did not confer a kind of territorial sovereignty by virtue of using it, so.
And that's amazing and fascinating. And it's also yet another example of American exceptionalism, right? No, we're going to define it our way, and the rest of the world can define it their way, but this is how we're going to define it and parcel it. And it's just such a great example. And as you pointed, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just add one point, which is one of the key reasons the US ultimately did not sign off on the UN conferences on the law of the sea in the 1980s was that other nations were demanding technology transfer be baked into it, so that whatever deep sea mineral technologies the US developed, they would have to share with the Soviet Union, they would have to share with developing nations. And the United States admitted its own, like they played their cards, they showed their cards and said, no, we want to assure our technological advantage. So even though there was a lot of recourse to, it's international, we all share in this, like, you know, the resources of the sea, it became clear that the United States did not want to share any technologies that could take advantage of, say, like manganese nodules in the deep sea. So, so we have American exceptionalism brought to you by Mineral Pursuits once again.
So this is, and it's a great transition to, because, you know, since you've mentioned it, so by the 60s in your book, we have the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and the Interior Department is involved basically in the entire world, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East. And it's at the height of the, you know, arguably the height of the Cold War. And so you mentioned, you know, not wanting to share technology and not even agreeing to the UN treaty, but how does the US now? Because here we have, you know, these broader Cold War interests. We have the U.S. by the 60s is heavily involved in a shooting war in Vietnam, but it's also competing for hearts and minds, not just in Southeast Asia, but around the world. So how does it balance this Cold War interests, attempting to win hearts and minds in the third world, and corporate interests, which seems to be, you know, underlying so much of this story, and they're always there. And so I'm curious how that plays out in this.
Well, in short, awkwardly, it remains awkward, but there are very nimble ways that these actors respond and adjust rhetoric, I think, to make this all make sense. And I guess the first part, it still is something I'm thinking about in the chapter you describe about the continental shelf. So part of the response to what's playing out internationally is an incentive to further develop these resources that seem closer to home. So the continental shelf is one of those resources that is held up as a kind of counterpoint to the volatility elsewhere. The United States is struggling to convince nations that are rapidly decolonizing, that are growing in power as a unit at the United Nations, that they mean well, especially vis-a-vis Vietnam. And so that's part of where their energies and investments go. But they also are still clearly trying to use international development as an arena of showcasing America's benevolent credentials, even as they are still interested in resources in these other countries. But a kind of third part of this story is recourse to a kind of global commons or an international cooperation that, of course, international development somewhat taps into. But part of what I also see in the 60s is not only a move to the continental shelf, but also to outer space as a way to think about inoffensive arenas of potential extraction, whether it's these kind of insincere but kind of serious attempts to try to figure out how to mine the moon, which, hey, it's unpopulated, it can't offend anybody. But also then, you know, a kind of more technological, practical solution to that, which is showcasing a satellite that can help ostensibly people across borders, not just the United States, and in identifying resources and solving problems related to land use that anyone could see the kind of value in. And that's where the kind of history of Landsat emerges. And to speak directly to the problem of the US war in Vietnam, there is a speech that Nixon gives in 1969, where it is clearly trying to speak to an international community and distract from the war that is being waged by the United States. And what it points to is this satellite that is in the works, that is about bringing a greater good to a world community. It's about schools of fish, you know, it's about environmental concern that now we look at a Republican president celebrating environmentalism in that fashion, and it seems like it shouldn't make sense. In the 1960s and 70s, it was more possible to see that kind of resonance. And the global stewardship of the earth helped to salve the very clear unilateral and imperial engagements that were unfolding so strikingly, so violently at the same time.
So it's a great transition to the other favorite chapter, which is, and again, what separates the book from other monographs. And I think, again, you take it from land to sea and then sea to space. And I think Landsat, it's a fascinating discussion.
Mhm.
And as you describe it, you write that it's a dramatic continuation of the department's century-long pursuit of new frontiers. And you've already hinted at how it was pitched to the world, right?
Mhm.
What the satellite was supposed to do.
Right.
But what did it do? And and it's launched in 1972. We
Yeah.
already have, I mean, you've already kind of given it away, because if Nixon's involved, we already know that it's not going to do what it's supposed to do. So this is.
So thanks for asking. I love talking about this chapter because it has always just completely boggled my mind in so many ways. First, the continuation part. Continuation, I think, is such a great word because the problem that sort of incentivizes this satellite, that that is being addressed with this satellite, is difficulty accessing terrains in third world nations that the Interior Department geologists are still working in, right? So Brazil is a classic kind of case in the broader history of this satellite. We learn that geologists embedded in Brazil in particular were struggling to access these imagined lucrative interiors, even though they had spent decades working on this problem, and they just longed for a kind of pathway that produced less friction, that could allow them to see and visualize and know where to go next. So they called for a geological laboratory in space. This was not surprising, given that so many geologists had been brought on to work with NASA to deal with the problem of landing a man on the moon. They were training Neil Armstrong in geology and thinking about a different kind of practical problem of how to survey remotely. And some of the geologists working for NASA were unsurprisingly thinking about problems of geology on Earth and just kind of started to apply the methods from the moon remote surveying to then pointing it back on the Earth and thinking about how that could radically expand one's vision of the resource potential of the planet. So this is the 1960s. This is Stuart Udall and his US Geological Survey Director, William Pecora, responding to these changes that personnel they oversee are involved in. And what I think is so fascinating is that Pecora himself, who is like a key champion of trying to make a satellite that can survey minerals to help the people in Brazil, had himself made his career by being one of the first geologists in Brazil in the 1940s. So he had authored very important, influential reports that were surveying things like, for example, mica in Brazil. In the 40s, by the 1960s, when he's heading the Geological Survey, it makes perfect sense to him that they should throw the full force of the Interior Department behind supporting this kind of gleaming, fancy initiative in the now Johnson administration, involving the space race, which itself had a prestige and an allure that is not insignificant, right? So Udall actually makes a divisive power play to ensure that this satellite gets done, even though the White House, national security advisors, and NASA were not ready to avow that they were developing this technology, keeping in mind the Soviet Union and other potential critics that someone like Walt Rostow would identify as saying, like, Walt Rostow wanted this technology, but also pointed out that some people could label it spying, like huge,
Right.
huge stretch of the imagination to think that a satellite that could view oil would be anywhere near spying. But for these reasons, they had been cautious. Udall announces it. He like issues an announcement of Project Eros is what they were calling it at the time, and gets in a lot of trouble for speaking ahead of turn, but also kind of forced their hand because to cover it up and to not go proceed with the project would avow the kind of negative intent or intent. So, so the project moves along, and part of how it builds consensus is like both this promise of a practical benefit of space exploration in the form of minerals development, but also by saying and genuinely believing in the case of Udall that the satellite would do far more than that. It would help with all kinds of environmental issues. We could monitor ice caps and crop cycles and deforestation, and it genuinely did get supporters and bring in different user agencies that sought a more biologically diverse range of uses through the satellite. But it doesn't change the fact that the kind of primary original intent was minerals, which helps to explain why in the first decade of usage, mineral industries and oil industries were the key beneficiaries of this technology. This is something critics by the end of the decade would admit, like, hey, we're subsidizing exploration for oil companies. But it's also evident in the way that an entire Landsat lobby emerges that is including 100 oil and mining firms who see in this a kind of potential unmatched since the magnetometer of the 1940s that had been a wartime geological survey, accidental discovery that became important to prospecting. And this allows the United States and allied mining companies, which are now more complicated and more multinational than they had ever been, to open up new terrains to investment. Sudan is one example that I point to. I mean, very recently, diplomatic relations had been restored between the United States and Sudan. The US aid apparatus returns to Sudan, and through this kind of this earthbound complex of the ongoing international development activity, and then the kind of technological capability of visualizing Earth from outer space, the United States was able to identify the first and start to develop the first onshore oil wells for Chevron. So this is one instance that kind of fits a broader pattern in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Central African Republic, in Morocco, and elsewhere, and is something that many scholars have been thinking about more recently, and they tend to see it a little bit differently from me. By not focusing on minerals, they kind of take seriously this legacy of environmental stewardship that is so baked into the Landsat satellite today. And it is today used for an array of environmental uses, including tracking patterns related to climate change. But when I focus in on this first decade, a very critical period in its use, I see a process that is incentivizing the extraction and ultimately combustion of fossil fuels in a way that creates the climate catastrophes, or certainly amplifies the ones that are then trying to be mitigated using the same technology. There's also a question, a very important question about what this technology meant to developing nation participants. And it did seem, and genuinely was, a kind of scientific and technological form of aid that was desired. You know, genuinely, many scientists saw value in this. But when you look at the larger structure, I see a huge disadvantage that is built into it, and consciously so, to the extent that oil and mining firms represented such a disproportionate user in that period that could not be counterbalanced by all of the members of the United Nations, basically, you know. So yeah, the Landsat satellite helped add fuel to a fire that now it's used to try to put out. It's kind of the short version.
I think it's such a great aspect of the book, and of the story, because it fits so well in with, and I want to come back to this, the imperial amnesia that runs really through the book, that you come back to several times. But before we get there, if we can, we should probably talk about James Watt, right? So the Reagan administration and James Watt, everybody's favorite Secretary of the Interior.
Oh my.
And
himself.
And it's, he's such a departure from Udall and Ickes. It's deliberate. And I think what's great is that, as you describe it, is that it's a shift from Interior to the Department of Defense, is one way you describe it. But in between, for mineral, for mineral interest in that sense, but in between, what we have is Watt, who has anti-government views, and much like the Reagan administration, I mean, this is one of the reasons why he's selected. And how is that reproduced in his policy, in the policies that are pursued and implemented? And what was the reaction? I think it's such a great part of the book. And then if we can, then I'll come back to the imperial amnesia, because I think that's an important way to end the discussion, if that's okay.
Totally. Watt is a huge kind of inflection point or turning point, and part of how I understand him in relation to the broader process of the Interior Department is that he capitalizes on certain capacities that had long been a part of the department. Or another way of putting this is, if the Interior Department had long struggled to balance its role regulating and promoting capitalism, it had nevertheless often had both of those at play. I see time and time again how important promoting capitalism has been, even though what we often see as its image is regulating capitalism. Watt was somebody who wanted to gut entirely the regulatory functions for a no-holds-bar promotional capitalism agenda. It's something that he pursued as a lawyer in the American West before getting the appointment. And it's something that then, on the recommendation of the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank that's certainly shaping Reagan policies, is materializing as a kind of defunding of key civilian regulatory capacities of the Interior Department. And by that, I mean there are parts of it that oversee the environmental impact statement, and this is something that has changed also because the EPA had been created in between like the Udall era and the Watt era as a direct result of the failing of the Interior Department to administer safely the Continental Shelf when the Santa Barbara oil spill happened. So the EPA certainly takes over part of that functioning, and yet the Geological Survey that remained in Interior still also had an obligation to ensure that certain minerals development happened at a kind of pace that was aligned with the public good and not the private profit line. So Watt was trying to redirect all capacities in the Geological Survey to exploration, and to also increase the kind of extraction agenda in places like Native American reservations, themselves also part of the Interior Department. Meanwhile, Watt is gutting the funds that exist on the reservation to help support them in the form of housing and urban development, job training, and other things that were not perfect and had discriminatory policies that we learn more and more about, but that nevertheless provided vital funding and a kind of life stream to many Indigenous communities. So one example from the book that I refer to is that in Navajo Reservation, unemployment soared from 45% before Reagan to 75% in the Reagan and Watt era as a direct response to this, like, burn down the government from within. But by that, they meant burn down the part of government that asks about the public good, that asks about well-being, that regulates for the purposes of safety, and double down on those things that are going to help to identify and unearth more minerals. So this process is one that has to be understood not as oh, Reagan defunded everything, because of course we know at the same time, Reagan actually redirected those funds and amplified spending to a completely unprecedented extent in the form of defense spending. So through shadow wars in Central America and elsewhere, through the Star Wars, like nuclear defense initiative, strategic defense initiative, Reagan would rack up, hundreds of billions of dollars of deficit and kind of rewire, in my mind, the government capacities for doing the work of pursuing U.S. national and private interests in minerals. So in my mind, while the Interior Department doesn't get burned down to the ground, while it doesn't disappear, and while its role mitigating or mediating between public and private doesn't disappear, some of its capacities for doing so on a global scale do. And it's not just the defense spending, it's also changes in international development that are important as the model moves towards like microfinance and privatization. It also has to do with Interior's struggle to showcase its legitimacy after being shown to be a hugely negligent steward of indigenous resources in the 1970s as well. So basically it's complicated, but we do see in many ways a kind of willingness to just showcase like base material interest. And I don't know, another way of thinking of it, and my story doesn't detail this so much, but other great works have, how US military power in this moment comes to be seen as a humanitarian arm, as doing humanitarian work. And perhaps that helps to explain how US mineral interests could be pursued in ways that still allow American exceptionalism to seem intact, even as the kind of good cop is gone. Like the good cop is no longer in the room, and it's now the kind of military might that we might have associated with the period before the Interior Department had been operating in this way.
And I think what's fascinating about the story you tell is we see some shades of that today, in the sense that using elements within government to destroy any kind of aspects for the public good, right? So, inserting individuals, those like, in the James Watt mode, those who are completely opposed to some of Interior's mission as Secretary of Interior, et cetera. And we see that, replicated in the current administration. So I think what, as I mentioned already, what runs through the book several times is this idea of imperial amnesia. You close with a story about imperial amnesia in Afghanistan after 9/11, and pursuit of minerals that are now vital for 21st century commerce and industry. But there's a broader story of imperial amnesia that's really at the heart of the book, right? Which is this perception of the Interior Department as a home for conservationists, right? And that this whole other history, as you've just mentioned, is either is out of view, much like the Continental Shelf, it's out of view, or like Landsat. We talk about how Landsat is important now for to environmentalists and looking at the extent of environmental damage, but what's ignored is how much it had contributed to that. So that amnesia that runs through, but there's also this other amnesia that I think we need to talk about, which is because technical expertise was such a key component of the Interior Department. And yet it's something when we talk about climate change that the United States, the exceptional nation, right, that we keep coming back to, has also been exceptional in that it has been so reluctant over the past 2 to 3 decades to embrace the science and the technical expertise. And I'm curious, do you see that as part of your story? Or do you see that as where the story goes, or the kind of inevitable result of the story that you trace? Or do you see climate change in a different fashion?
It's such a great retrospective, because I wonder how the book might have finished if it had taken just a few more years to be published, because the epilogues are, and some of the key lessons seem to be like they're a moving target rather than a fixed one. Because technical expertise is something that throughout the book, I maintain a healthy amount of skepticism about by virtue of the way it has so often been a front for imperial intentions, or at the very least, intentions that look a lot more like the exploitation of raw materials drawing on a racialized labor force. Like that's pretty close to empire, right? So the United States nevertheless continued to pursue those kinds of uneven arrangements. And yet technical expertise in our current moment seems like such a lifeline against the like an array of dangers that confront the public in a global sense. So I do see my story as showing perhaps through this international lens, a way that we can understand some of the failings of liberal administrations that sought to provide good things in a kind of domestic sense through the form of provision, through the social safety net, through Johnson's Great Society. But what we are confronted with is that often those things came even as US power in foreign zones was highly problematic. And I say this with the caveats that, of course, the New Deal and Great Society also had serious problems with racial injustice. But one can see how people might be disillusioned with technical expertise when one is thinking about this kind of international relations problem. However, I think what we see more so in US domestic politics and the problem of like misinformation and distrust in science along the coronavirus response and also along climate denialism has perhaps a different trajectory than the one that I explain. And it's not separate from the administrations of FDR and Johnson and, this kind of consensus that had for a time been built around the idea that there is a kind of, there is a line below which no one should fall, and there is government expertise that can be marshaled to allow for that outcome. But yeah.
And a belief, there's and this belief in kind of a technocratic expertise that will save, that we can look to save us, and that represents the United States. I mean, if we think back to whether you mentioned Walter and Rostow, when we think about the modernization theorists, when we think about how they viewed technical expertise, and you detail much of this in the book, and I think it's fascinating that today Dr. Fauci is the most trusted man in America, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
And yet that's also a point of derision. And it was this morning, the day we're actually taping this interview. So I think it's an amazing book. I want to hold up the cover again. I want to thank you again for writing it, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I ask what your and we can close with kind of a discussion about your next project and how and if it relates to the global theory and how, and then and again, just to thank you for taking the time. It's really amazing.
Awesome. Well, this has been such a special conversation, and I feel like I'm going to be left with this great provocation of your many questions, but especially these ones about what are these lessons about technical experts as well in relation to our current moment. So the new project will focus less on technical experts. Maybe that's why I'm not in the mindset, in part because I am shifting to consider those on the ground a bit more who are responding to mining campaigns.
Right.
But in order to tell their story, I'm realizing I still also have to talk about those campaigns, those who are trying to initiate mining, and specifically a kind of metals mining that was really taking off in the 1970s as a result of the communications revolution and other features of post-1970s globalization. So even though I am very, guilty of this myself, I often think of the 70s in terms of oil and fossil fuels. I am being challenged to kind of look at a complex of extraction that was very related and interconnected, but that also had a slightly different shape to it, and that was still very multinational. So companies like Amex is one that I'm really focused on, that is also featured in the global interior as a constantly shape-shifting corporation, furthering its global portfolio of investment, but never leaving the American West as a key site of exploitation. However, there are also local communities drawing on environmental frames, as well as frames tied to the indigenous sovereignty movement, that are challenging the companies and that are beginning to share their own strategies through NGOs, through kind of intermediaries. So some of the story will entail looking at places around the world that were able to kind of connect to and learn from experiences in one place or the other. So one example is a molybdenum mine in Crested Butte, Colorado. Some of the actors, through things like Friends of the Earth, through Fulbright fellowships, end up in New Zealand and are finding a community that has the exact same problem facing Amex and Amoco and Rio Tinto Zinc, in part because changes in the financial and technological patterns of the 1970s and 80s are incentivizing investment in these places. But yeah, I'm in such early stages, but I'm hoping to see these circuits and kind of lean into the metaphor of circuitry as well, to think about an important part of 1970s globalization from the ground, maybe. It's not the satellite's eye view, but it is also still trying to think about how can it be transnational still? Can I connect with these sites of extraction? Because the activists themselves did, and were conscious of and drew inspiration from like the symbols and tactics of people who were struggling thousands of miles away.
Dr. Megan Black, thank you so much. The Global Interior is an amazing book, and I can't thank you enough for writing it. Thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are, and I thank you for taking the time to come to talk to us about the book, and we look forward to having you at Syracuse.